Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go! I've been living in my house for over 10 years now. My next door neighbor were a nice old couple, and I have had a wonderful relationship with them over the years. Nearly a year ago, my good neighbor suffered from a heart attack and sadly, he couldn't make it. And a few weeks after, his wife decided that it was too much for her to stay in the same house without her beloved husband and decided to move to a different city to be near her daughter, who insisted that she come live with her after her father passed. But the thoughtful lady wanted to live in a separate place to not crowd her daughter's house and be a burden on her. Anyways, they put their house up for sale, and eventually a couple of entitled idiots ends up buying it. They were in their early 50s, and the word rude doesn't even begin to describe how they always treated every neighbor around them from the get-go. Demanded them to do some major changes to their own houses because it's looking bad to them whenever they look at it. Clearly, the wife Karen was on the HOA board back in the community they were living in. So yeah, you could get where the demanding part is coming from. She was used to this, and it seems that she got her way most of the time. One day, she came to my doorstep, rang my doorbell, and demanded that I invite her in so she could discuss a serious matter with me. I complied with her nonsense, not because I have to, but just because that's how I was raised. It was all about good manners to me. I let her in, sit her down, and get her some fresh juice. She makes a snarky comment about the juice, but I let it slide. At the end of the day, she's a guest and she's in my house, so I tolerated her nonsense a bit more than usual. Then she starts talking about how her son is planning on getting married 6 months from now, and how he's been looking lately for a house to live in after he ties a knot. More like they are looking for a house for him since he can't afford crap himself. They wanna buy him a house. Up until this point, I had no idea what the hell I was supposed to do with all this pointless information to someone like me. I mean, yeah, congratulations and all, but okay. Why are you telling me this? Do you want me to lend you some money, or what exactly do you want from me? I had no idea. That is until she started spouting the most insane, entitled demands anyone has ever asked of me. I want to buy your house for my son. I didn't realize it at first. It went right over my head. I was like, okay, what house? As far as I know, I don't own any houses other than this one I'm living in. So you must have been mistaken about something. Whatever house you're interested in buying, it's not really mine. At the time, I didn't even think that she would dare ask me or anyone else something like what you're all thinking right now. She then asks me, "Isn't this your house? You're the owner, right? You're not renting it." Well, yeah, this house is mine, but what does that have anything to do with what you're asking me about? Everything. It has everything to do with what I'm talking about. Because the house I want you to sell me is this house. I didn't believe what I just heard for a second. I had to ask her a couple more times just to make sure she meant this house I've been living in for 10 years now. When it dawned on me, I couldn't help but ask her, okay, so after I sell it to you, where am I supposed to go? And her answer was, that isn't really my problem, is it? I mean, you could go wherever you want to go. I don't know, try another state or something. That's your choice. I don't want to force anything on you. I just couldn't help it. I jumped out of my seat instinctively and screamed, "Get out." She seemed genuinely confused, as if she didn't know what the hell she just did. She asked me, "What? What's the meaning of this?" I kept shouting, "Get out of my house right now. Are you freaking mad?" She blurted some nonsense in return on her way out, but eventually went back to her house after she stopped for a bit right in front of mine and started calling me names. And she didn't move until I threatened to call the cops and tell them that she was harassing me. After this encounter, she started making my life a living hell. She tried annoying the hell out of me in hopes that she could drive me away from my own home. Even had her brats send thugs to my doorstep and office to intimidate me into selling my house to them. One day, I returned to my house and found my teenage kids freaking out and my daughter shaking and crying in the front yard. And when I asked what's wrong, they said, "There is a snake in the house." What? A snake in my house? Since when do we get snakes in this area? It's not even possible seeing things like that where I live. I called 911 and animal control, and they arrived within 15 minutes after asking us to stay outside. They went in and started searching for it, and after 35 minutes, they managed to catch the snake, but stayed for another 30 minutes to excessively search for more snakes since we had no idea how many of them were there. While all of that happened, most of the nearby neighbors stood by us outside of our house to check what's going on, and some even tried to calm down my kids, and they were very supportive. All except our entitled neighbors. They never got out of their house. Clearly, a disaster was happening to their next door neighbor, but none of them bothered to check what was going on. I knew they were inside because I noticed them looking from behind the window curtains in their house, while being weirdly calm about the whole situation. And when I caught myself thinking that they might be responsible for that snake showing up in my house, I felt guilty because I shouldn't be thinking horribly of someone just because I had a bad encounter with them before. I know what you're thinking, but believe me, I myself don't know how I got that far in life with this naive mindset of mine either. But I promise it's not like that anymore. At least not after what happened with these jerks. It took us all some time to start living comfortably in our house after this one incident. We were frightened for weeks, paranoid, and even imagining that the shadows in our peripheral vision were crawling on the floor or onto our beds. It was a traumatic experience to some degree, but we're good now. A couple of weeks go by and I wake up at night to some extremely loud screaming coming from around my house. I jumped out of my bed, checked on my kids, then called the cops even before knowing what's going on and told them that I'm hearing horrific screaming coming from around my house. Gave them the address and bolted out to the door. At first, I didn't see anything up front, but when I followed the sound, it took me to the back of my house as I suspected. And there she was. Karen is laying flat on her back, screeching like a banshee, and on top of her were two snakes crawling all over her body. I was overwhelmed by what I was seeing and had too many questions flying across my head at once, but her screaming brought my attention back to her and forced me to focus on getting her out of that situation. I tried to find a long stick or something to get those snakes off of her. I kept trying to push them away and even yelled at her to get up and get away from them, but she kept crying that she has been bitten and that she is paralyzed and can't move. It didn't take long for the cops to show up. They tried to help her themselves until the EMTs and animal control arrived, and eventually the whole situation was contained. Snakes were captured and she was taken to the hospital, all while screaming about how she's going to get me arrested and evicted from my own house for putting her life in danger by raising snakes all around my house. What she didn't know at the time is that after the first incident with a snake being found in my house, I couldn't really shake the feeling that this was not a coincidence or just bad luck. Just some random snake decided to wander into some populated neighborhood away from any kind of forests nearby. I wanted to grab a cup of coffee in this one house of ours. Nah, I didn't know how to buy that. I mean, yeah, I was a bit naive, but I don't know, I just couldn't shake off that feeling. So I went and installed a couple of cameras around the house. I thought that this solution was satisfying for me at the moment. I am not directly accusing anyone of bringing a snake to my doorstep, but at the same time, I'm taking my precautions and not fully ignoring my doubts and the alarms going off in my head. But classic me completely forgot about my cameras. I didn't check the tapes until my son brought it to my attention the next day. That hey, we have cameras. We could check what went down last night using them, right? Oh wow, cameras, yeah, let's do that. And we were shocked from what we saw on that tape. Karen was sneaking into our backyard with a dirty bag in her hand. She was carrying it carefully and she was very keen on not getting it near her. She then came near my basement's wooden back door that was not in its best shape, by the way, and started to carefully open the bag bit by bit, as if she's trying to pour what's in the bag into a small hole I had to one of the wooden doors. And of course, as you may think by now, she brought the two snakes in this bag she was carrying and she was clearly trying to sneak them into my house again. But to her surprise, one of the snakes decided to crawl the other way towards her once he got out, and that was obviously enough to spook her. She panicked and tried backpedaling but quickly fell on her behind, and that's when the other snake crawled out of the bag, still in her hand, and decided to have a field trip on her body. It seemed indeed that she was bitten a few times after she freaked out the snakes with her screaming, but I later learned that both of them weren't really that dangerous and that she was fine, and that what paralyzed her that day was probably the fear, not the venom. After I was done watching this, let's just say that it's an understatement if I say that my blood was boiling. I took some time to calm down, and after that I got my son to get a copy of the tape, and I took it to the station right away to file a report against her, and well, press charges of course. I won't bore you with what happened next because it took some time and a lot of legal details that an idiot like myself hardly understands, but after taking this whole thing to court, she was found guilty. And eventually she was sentenced to 10 years in prison among other things. Plus, we're now filing for a lawsuit to get compensated for the emotional damages we had to endure. Her husband ended up selling their house after that to fund the court fees and for potentially paying me for the recent lawsuit we filed. Plus, it's impossible for them to keep living in this neighborhood after everyone knew what they did to us. And also, from what I've heard, their son's fiancée left him after knowing what his crazy mother did to her neighbors. Overall, that was some really horrible experience I had to go through with my family, but at least there's a bright side to it. I locked up a Karen, gonna get loads of money from her, and I have an interesting story for you guys to listen to. Imagine being in high school back in the later days of George Bush and finally buying that iPod of your dreams. After saving up your allowance and the money you made around the neighborhood doing random work and lifeguarding at the local pool. Yep, that was me. And I was that douchebag 14-year-old who would make sure you knew I had one of the better iPods, one that could play video. It was the latest Nano, if I remember right. Simpler times. But every story needs an antagonist. My sister happened to find that role many times. We are very close now, but back then, it wasn't so rosy. She was a teenager as well and spent most of those years resenting me. If I had something nice, screw you for having that. I was quite protective of my precious iPod, and she raised quite the storm when my parents refused to buy her one. Your brother saved his money. We didn't pay for it. We are not stopping you from buying one too if you save your money. That was her attitude toward any luxury that us kids wanted, even up to that time when buying a first car was on the table. We each had to buy our own. It built character and taught responsibility. Well, that iPod goes missing one day at home when I knew damn well I had left it charging at the family computer. I left it unattended. My parents confirmed they did not touch it, and all eyes were on my sister. I'll jump ahead right here. As it turned out, she had indeed taken it and had one of her friends temporarily store it until the heat was off of her. She knew my parents would essentially strip search her. After this unraveled, one of my buddies saw her with my iPod at school several days later. It was time for payback. Back then, I liked to think of myself as a bona fide hacker. That's right, I knew all about batch files and how to open command prompt. Don't freaking cross me, you have no idea what I'm capable of. Yeah, anyway, we don't talk about those dark days, but I actually did know enough to copy/paste some destructive commands into scripts, using delete and registry delete commands and the like. In the days of Windows XP, this would essentially require reinstalling the operating system. I also was aware of a program called Bitten.exe, which could package your batch files and associated files that would call from the same directory into a small exe file, and you could pick an icon to slap on that exe if you had that ICO file on hand. It doesn't take a genius to devise a plan here, because as much as I thought I was one, I wasn't. I put a script together with the worst crap I could muster, and gave it the Internet Explorer icon. This went onto my sister's computer, which was an old Pentium M laptop, which barely had enough crap to load MySpace at the time. My hacker abilities allowed me to log into the administrator account by booting into safe mode, or something like that, and simply replacing the iExplorer.exe main file with my science experiment. I believe I had it to where it actually opened the real Internet Explorer in parallel, so I could deny this more easily. Fast forward to that magical moment, she's home from color guard practice and is ready for an evening full of crappy webcam photos that use every mid-2000s effect ever created. But before she can upload them, disaster. The screen resolution goes up, and the color profile is 16 colors for some reason. Random pop-up messages every few seconds. Microsoft Windows has detected the giant C word. Please consider a system upgrade. Stuff like that. Your hard drive is jammed with peanut butter. Restart required. The whole script plays out and she's left with a paperweight until someone can get around to sorting it out. Unfortunately, the computer guy in the family took quite a while to get around to it. My dad knew damn well that I had something to do with this, even if he didn't understand it fully. He made my sister apologize to me before I helped her with her laptop and made her buy me a new case for it. After she threw away the one, I had to try and make it less identifiable. Well, that's the story, folks. I have a video from 8+ years ago, this script running in a virtual machine if anyone wants to see it. Edit. To people asking what happened to the iPod, I got it back after learning from my buddy that she was going to have it on her. She was in a world of crap from my very traditional disciplined bad child parents, in addition to her laptop being a boat anchor for a few weeks. I, female 33 at the time, once had a run-in with a blatant bully. My family owns a business, we come from a lower middle class neighborhood and kept close contact after we moved. Jane, female 93, was in her 70s at the time, was our old neighborhood friend. She was an office worker all her life. She was one of the forever dwellers in our neighborhood. I had a especially close bond with her, but not anymore. Jane worked 40 years at a factory, then got a job at another manufacturing company. After retirement, she got laid off, so she found a job at a dentist's office. Dr. Jake owned 3 dental offices, so he depended on his employees to keep things running while he wasn't around. Jane worked for him for about 5 years. Jane and the other workers, all females, formed some sort of a clique. They loved her because she was their elderly pal. I would visit Jane on some Saturday afternoons, bring pizza or lasagna, and enjoy how the day ended in my old stomping grounds, just like in the good old days. I left my old neighborhood when I was 16, but I still cherish it. She always talked about her work friend, and sometimes they picked her up from an outing or they would carpool to the supermarket. There was this friend in particular, Nancy, female 60s. She was the one who seemed most friendly with Jane. I'd like to add that I never ever had a conversation with any of these women, much less any type of a fight. As their relationship progressed, Jane volunteered lots of information about Nancy's life. She was more or less a lonely female who loved to gossip and was involved in a relationship with a married man, Ed, male, now maybe 43, whose wife worked as a receptionist for about 3 minutes away from the dental practice. Jane said Nancy was crazy because she liked to stalk her lover's wife and gave him money often. Help with a loan monthly payment, help pay for his car, buy him food so that he would come visit, give him 100 here, 80 bucks there, and so on. Their friend group was tight so much that Jane would call them to clock her in. They would do this for each other all the time. My friend who also knew Jane kept telling me the office always seemed empty except for the days when the doctor showed up. Jane suddenly lost her job. My mom took her in when our secretary got sick. My mom kept Jane in even after our secretary came back, and for years it was all good. Jane maintained the friendship with Nancy and the girls. Because we worked closely, I heard Jane tell lots of gossip about Nancy's private life. This seemed odd. Also, she had fits whenever Nancy called her. She would say, "Oh my god, again? So needy." This usually took place Nancy's insisting calling on lunch breaks whenever she heard something about Ed's married life. She was devastated to learn his wife was pregnant again, or that he bought the wife a new car and so on. For those wondering, I grew up with Jane having a place in my life, just like an aunt. Jane would usually wait on the sidewalk because Nancy would come to pick her up after work so that they could eat dinner together after work. So basically, I was very loyal and very diehard. Nancy would sometimes wave goodbye at us, but nothing more. There were rumors that that dental office may close down. No heck, Sherlock. Patients must have been switching doctors because office hours were erratic. The remaining days when a doctor was not, it was supposed to be used for scheduling, which wasn't happening. Jane said she never indulged in this, just saw them do it. Jane's job was simple, never had anything to do with money. She was with us most of the time on a computer, simple as that. Patrice, our secretary, came to me one day and said she had something to share. She was very worried because of Jane's closeness to our family. Patrice said she had caught Jane persistently going to our cash box and counting the money. When Jane saw her, she said she had permission to guard the petty cash. Until then, we never had any reason to distrust Jane. Patrice said she was coming forward because she was scared something might happen. I wanted to make sure her name was clear. We were shocked and baffled. It seemed ridiculous, but we still changed the box location. Again, it happened. We set up cameras and caught her counting the money, about twice a day. She was caught taking bills, crushing them in her fists, and stashing them in her chest on 3 occasions during the same week. We never paid attention because our business is based mostly on electronic transactions, so the cash is left for buying stuff and other small purchases. So in a week, she took about $350. This is the price you pay for not having control over each dime. We just left our petty cash lie in a box. We will never know how much she actually took. We confronted her with a video. She got mad at us and left the job. Obviously, she told everyone else her own version. My mom and I were so astonished it took us months to assimilate. I'm talking about a woman who was invited to 500% of family events and was handsomely paid at work. We moved on as usual. Some old neighbors would occasionally tell us that Jane complained she was fired for no reason. Patrice was yelled at the mall by one of Jane's friends because she was a thief but had Jane scapegoated. About 3 years later, my mom went to eat at a seafood restaurant. She is very hardworking and never takes me time. She went to eat but told me she ran into Nancy, who was sitting nearby with some other women. Jane wasn't there, so Nancy bullied my mom, who was sitting by herself. She cracked jokes, wouldn't stop walking by her table, and saying things under her breath. Nancy clicked mean girl mode and cracked jokes. Then, they stood up kind of surrounding her. My mom was intimidated, so she just paid and left. Mom said Nancy yelled something like, "Hey, can't take the heat?" Mom tried to conceal her feelings, but I know she was hurt. Nobody should have to go through this. I was pissed, but Mom begged me to leave it at that. Okay, I was paying for my stuff at a local mom and pop's pharmacy I visit quite often. The pharmacy is on the same street as Nancy's job. Our business pretty close to everything. For this reason, it's like the first choice to buy anything, so I was there on a Sunday morning, which I really like because the street is empty. I was talking to a friend on my earphones. I'm first in line, already paying, but I heard strange sounds from the line. Because this isn't a Walgreens or big box retailer, the pay line is kind of less organized. I keep hearing laughter and a loud voice from the line, and the cashier begins to look uncomfortable. Because I'm on my headphones, I'm not 100% aware of what whoever is talking is saying. The cashier keeps looking at someone in a line and the lady 2 spaces away from me says, "We don't need that." I saw Nancy pointing at me. Honestly, I was confused at first. So I tell my friend on the phone to hold on. Nancy is laughing at me, pointing at me, and she's telling everyone, "Look, she's crazy, talking to herself." She knows damn right about the existence of earphones. She tries to rally the people on a line by cracking jokes and calling me a dumb witch. I took off my earphones. I was so angry my arm was tingling. I told Nancy I wasn't going to do anything inside the pharmacy because I respect that place, but I know who she is and I'll wait for her outside. Her face changed. I gave her the option to repeat and tell me to my face the whole thing she said/did to my mom, since she feels so superior that she's messing with me. Nancy got quiet immediately. I got my stuff and told her I would be outside. I waited outside and the witch never came out. So I hop in my car and 5 minutes later, she comes out. I think she thought I left. So I drove my car really slow next to her and told her to tell me what the heck she said. And she kept walking. I yelled at her from my car that she better open her mouth and talk. But she didn't. Nancy went into a bakery nearby. She took a street on foot that had no entrance for me. No problem, I took the next entrance and parked at the bakery. I stood next to her and told her off, then ordered some food for takeout. I warned her that if she ever saw my mom or anyone in my family, she better cross the street. Oh, and please call your friend in my old neighborhood who put you up to this to see if she can come to help you now. Nancy just kept her head tilted to the side. I left, and I called Nancy's boyfriend's wife and told her. I gave her all of Nancy's details and how to get to her house based on Jane's constant gossip. Basically, Nancy lived about 3 blocks away from her job, in front of an Adventist church. I told her Nancy's car information. I didn't call as a snitch. I called saying I was Nancy, who suffered from rightful indignation. The woman hung up on me but took my next call again. I called the dentist at his other office. I said I was an inspector to get him to come personally on the phone. Once he did, I told him everything I knew but never gave my name. I called him lazy and incompetent to give an office and hung up. I do know for a fact that the dentist fired everyone because he closed the office down. My friend who worked nearby said Nancy would stop by every now and then, but he avoided her because she was needy and he didn't want her to latch onto him. He told him her boyfriend dumped her for calling his wife and said she was obsessive and irrational. I don't know much else. I never disclosed my involvement. I saw Nancy at the same pharmacy somewhere around 2015, more or less 10 years later, and she's extremely thin and bent over. She didn't even see me and I just kept walking. I do see Jane maybe every now and then at the farmer's market, but I don't talk to her. We just act like we don't know each other. Years ago, I was stationed in aviation school, where you go after boot camp to learn the job you'll be doing. Mine was long, almost a year. You really got to know each other well after that time. But by the time you left, everyone knew who Seaman Burrow was, and he likely owed them money. Burrow was horrible with money. Despite us all getting the same pay, he ran out within 3 days. He then spent the next week begging, borrowing, hence his nickname, and scrounging money from other sailors. Getting your money back was tough. He usually had to promise 25% interest to even get anyone to lend him cash. They made a million excuses not to pay you. The older guys were wise to him and didn't lend him money, so he always hit up the new guys. As a section leader, I constantly reminded my guys in our weekly musters not to lend him money, so my section was pretty safe. Other sections weren't. If you're reading this, you're likely picturing a guy you served with who was the same way. Fast forward to months later, and Burrow was about to graduate. He'd been leaving for his ship right afterwards, never to be seen again. Naturally, he owed money to 20 to 30 people, and they were on his back for this one last chance to get their money back. Payday was coming up, but I wasn't expecting anyone to be repaid. My roommate had other plans. He'd lent Burrow $40 months before. In return for the lend, he asked Burrow to use his truck to go to the bowling alley a couple times. As he didn't nag Burrow for his money back, Burrow gave him his truck a few times when he had duty. Unbeknownst to Burrow, Rumi had also copied the key. Rumi was a friendly guy and knew everyone in the quarters. He went around with a notebook and got a list of everyone who had lent money to Burrow, how much they lent, what it was for. All added up, it came to $600, I think. On payday, which was 1 or 2 days before Burrow left, he invited Burrow into our room, showed him the list, and reminded him to pay everyone what was owed. Burrow got bug-eyed when he saw the list, but naturally refused to pay anything. He was leaving. Rumi said, "Well, if you change your mind, let me know. I'll tell you where your truck is." He'd used his key and driven it off base and hidden it somewhere. A parking garage, if I remember correctly. When Burrow saw his truck was missing, he knew Rumi was serious. He stumped and cussed and threatened to tell the company commander, but he was stuck. Rumi hit the list and swore to deny everything, and we backed him up. The end? He wound up paying the money. Funny PS, though Rumi told me later he'd added a couple extra names on there of guys who'd left. Funny PS though, Rumi told me later he'd added a couple extra names on there of guys who'd left. And even better, one of Burroughs' victims got orders to the same ship 3 to 4 months later. We told him the whole story and made him promise to tell everyone when he got there. Background: I was dating a guy long distance last summer, and things were going pretty well. I was in DC and my boyfriend was in Chicago. I was about to move to Spain temporarily for a really cool opportunity, and my boyfriend and I discussed that after I returned to the US, I would move to Chicago and we'd go from being long distance to a normal couple. My lease was going to end right as I was going to move to Spain. Instead of finding a way to store all my things for a year and then subsequently move them to Chicago, I figured that this was a perfect time to downsize. I got rid of a lot of clothing, sold my furniture, and just decided to keep some essentials, sentimental items, and portable expensive electronics. I only brought the essentials to Spain, whatever would fit in my luggage. And my boyfriend offered to store my sentimental items and electronics. I didn't mind him using/borrowing the electronics while I was gone. Game console and games, JBL speaker, and my Hue lights. And he installed the Hue lights in his condo. I visited him for a week and a half right before moving to Spain, and we had a little bit of tension, and the visit was a little bit rocky. I thought we were going to be able to work through things and recover, but right as I moved to Spain, my boyfriend ghosts me for a month and then breaks up with me over a text message. We briefly text about how I can get my belongings back as well as around $400 he owes me. I am depressed and lacking a support group in Spain, coupled with a language barrier, and I decide to return to the US sooner than anticipated. And I actually end up moving to Chicago anyways because I was over DC and got a nice job offer in Chicago. My boyfriend returns my sentimental items on his own accord, but doesn't return my electronics other than my game console. I tried to contact him, but he blocked my number, Instagram, WhatsApp, Venmo, and Splitwise. I tried approaching him in person the couple of times I bumped into him and asked him if we could discuss my electronics and the money he owes me, and he completely blows me off and is extremely rude. Obviously, I conclude that he has no intention to return my electronics or pay me back the money he owes me, and I'm very angry. I try to be patient and diplomatic and attempt to talk to him a few more times whenever I bumped into him, but he was acting the same. I finally wrote him an email saying, "Don't worry about the money you owe me, just please return my things," and gave my roommate his phone number so that they could coordinate. He finally responds to my roommate and says that he will send someone over the weekend to return my things. Yay! When the person dropped off my things, they only brought the games and speaker. My boyfriend kept my Hue lights. I ran into him once more and asked him when I could get my Hue lights back. He shrugs. I asked him if he planned on returning them. He shrugs again. I asked him point blank if he was stealing them from me, and he says, "I guess you could call it that." I finally gave up. I decided to order new Hue lights and cut my losses. But there is a revenge. When I was setting up my new Hue lights, I noticed that I was still connected to my prior pair that my boyfriend had stolen, and that some of them were even on. I think it's a glitch or something and turned them off and don't think anything about it. But then they come back on. I was confused and curious, so I turned them off again. A few seconds later, they came back on. I suddenly realized that I was still connected and had just shut off my boyfriend's lights twice. I beam with excitement. I don't turn them off again because I don't want him to figure out what's going on. He doesn't work until about noon and likes to sleep in until 11 a.m. He's also very sensitive to light when he sleeps, so much so that he has blackout curtains so that he can sleep in that long. I personally wake up at 7 a.m. to go to work, so for the last couple of weeks, I've made a habit of turning his lights on at the same time that I wake up and watch them go off a few minutes later, giving me the sweet satisfaction that I'm disturbing his sleep in the morning. I don't think I've ever been so happy to wake up in the morning. I do this for a couple of weeks until he reaches out to my roommate and finally returned my lights last night. I suppose he thought they were defective or something. Obviously, I didn't post while I was enacting my revenge, as I didn't want my fun to be cut short. But now that my lights have been returned, I am posting. For just a tad bit more revenge, I hope he finds this post. It will be the icing on the cake. I want him to know that it was me.